really glad that you're spending an hour with us this evening to talk about school reopening. I see now that we're approaching about 300 participants this evening and really appreciate that you're here with us. We're going to jump in. Let me describe a little bit of the format of this evening's discussion. What we're planning to do is spend the opening few minutes, I imagine about the first 15 minutes, reviewing some information and bringing all of tonight's listeners up to speed on a variety of important things. They include new permission to reopen elementary schools effective just this week. We'll give you an update on collective bargaining, how that's going, and talk to you a little bit about vaccinations. We will have lots of time for discussion. We're planning to do a number of interactive methods. One has already started to take place. We used a thought exchange survey prior to the opening of this town hall that was sent out days ago. And so we'll start by reading a few of the questions that were upvoted most frequently through thought exchange. We're also going to go back and forth between the Q&A function of the Q&A feature of Zoom, apologies. And we'll also be taking live questions as well. So if you're interested in asking a question, hearing a response, you can use either of those methods, either by raising your hand, we will have live participation, or by typing a question into Q&A. So with that, I'm gonna get us started. I'll take just a second to share my screen. Let me just, for everybody who's just logged in, do one more set of introductions. My name is Brent Stevens. I'm the superintendent. I'm joined by School Board Director Julie Sinai. Welcome to you, Director Sinai, and thanks for being here. And then by my assistant, Jessica Lopez-Tejo, who makes all of these things happen behind the scenes. Thank you, Jessica. So we'll start just with a recap, about 15 minutes worth of background information that I hope sort of serves to bring all of the participants this evening up to speed, and that serves as a bit of background for our questions and discussion. I begin first by just wanting to acknowledge what feels like a very difficult moment that all of us are in. Of course, we've been experiencing ongoing difficulties since the onset of this pandemic. This particular moment seems especially, I think, to be marked by heightened anxiety. In our community, like so many communities in California and around the country, there is growing frustration and anger about the unevenness of school reopening. And I recognize that here in Berkeley, that frustration and anger is a part of the discussions that we're having. We also know that our students are suffering or deeply impacted by our ongoing reliance on distance learning and our school closures. And so we have to sort of start by acknowledging that this is a difficult moment where all of our emotions are running at a heightened state. And Director Sinai, do you want to offer just a brief introductory comment and then we'll jump into our presentation?
Sure, I'd love to. And thank you, Dr. Stevens, for hosting the town hall, and Jessica for your magic in making it all work. I want to extend sincere appreciation to everybody who has signed on tonight. I'm here on behalf of the board to listen to your thoughts, your ideas, your suggestions, your experiences, and your recommendations. While I may chime in on occasion, the superintendent is really here to provide the details and respond to the specific questions that you asked tonight. But I do want to take a moment to reiterate that the board has been very clear that we have always said and continue to say that we want to open schools as soon as our public health officials say that it is possible. We want to open with proper protocols. And we know that our local, at this moment in time, our local, our county, our state, and the CDC have all said that if you follow the proper protocols of masking, social distancing, hand washing, that it is safe to open. We are committed to keeping our students and our teachers and our staff safe, which is why we are continuing to work on providing testing opportunities and working with the city to get our teachers and staff vaccinated. While we know vaccinations aren't a requirement by the CDC, we know that it will make our teachers and staff and our families feel comfortable being back in the workplace. We also want to make sure that we're student-centered while at the same time we're being responsive to our teachers and staff. I am confident that we can do both. This has been probably the most trying and difficult time for all of the families of our communities, and it's the families of our students, the families of our teachers and our staff, the families of our administrators. We're all in this together and we're all struggling in different ways. And I hope that tonight's town hall gives more people the opportunity to engage and to share perspectives and to really help us get our schools open as soon as possible. So thank you again for being here, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Director Sinai. So here's the ground that I'd like to cover in just a few minutes. I want to talk to you about the now established permission to reopen our elementary schools and how it works to reopen our middle and high schools from a public health perspective. I'll talk a bit about district readiness and collective bargaining, vaccinations for school staff. We'll touch on reopening prospects for middle and high school, and then jump into the Q&A live discussion and the thought exchange questions that went out as a survey. I hope to sort of, the reason that we're covering all of these topics is this. For all of public school districts in California, we've essentially been traveling down 3 lanes simultaneously. In order to sort of affect a school reopening, we must actually have all of our sort of preparations in these 3 lanes completed. That includes both permission from public health officers to be able to reopen. It includes a demonstrated readiness by the district that all of the various facilities, prep, staff training, contact tracing, and testing is in place. And it also includes required labor agreements, in effect that we have bargained the impact of all of these changes to our employees' workday. And all of these things, because of a lattice of laws, are required of school districts. So the reason that we'll talk not only about the science and public health guidelines, but also about district preparedness and also about labor agreements, is that these 3 lanes in effect establish the joint criteria for being able to reopen. And we have to talk about all of them and actually satisfy all of the requirements in each of these lanes. I think most folks who are listening understand that just a couple of weeks ago, the state of California revised its school reopening criteria. It is now permissible for elementary schools to open in the purple tier. That used to not be the case. And the new threshold for reopening is 25 cases per 100,000 residents. The state of California also modified its reopening criteria for middle and high schools. It's now permissible for those schools to open in the red tier, which is associated with 7 cases per 100,000. These are new reopening criteria that went into effect on January 14th, so just a few weeks ago. If we pull up the metrics for today, we can see that we have clearly dipped below the 25 case rate. This was pulled at about 5:30 this morning, today, February 11th. You can see our transmission rate at about 18 cases and our overall test positivity rate as well, just under 5%. These metrics are falling, tend to be falling at about 1 case per 100,000 per day. And so we're seeing a steady decline, which is good news from a public health perspective and really good news from a school reopening perspective. These metrics establish the reopening thresholds for local public health officers. In effect, they give permission for schools to reopen. Also, over the last several months, but particularly in the last month, the state of California has assembled a really comprehensive sort of review of all of the literature as it relates to transmission in school settings. There is now a school reopening hub that has been launched by the state of California. And there you'll find a strong recap of all of the data suggesting that school reopening is safe. There are a number of key findings emerging from the data, and I'm pulling these directly from the state of California's website. They include findings over the course of this year of pandemic that children get COVID-19 less frequently and have less severe disease, that children who do get COVID-19 are most often getting it from a household contact, the transmission among students or from student to student is uncommon. that the transmission risks are lower in elementary schools than in other settings, and that this combination of risk mitigation strategies, masks, physical distancing, small stable groups, hand hygiene, ventilation, symptom screening, and asymptomatic testing, coupled with contact tracing, is a really potent way of ensuring that students and staff do not catch COVID-19 while they are at school. And then finally, data continues to point to the utility of testing students at staff in some regular cadence as a way of preventing outbreaks, should there perhaps be one. We're also following along with other districts here in California that have opened further than Berkeley, and that most districts here in the Bay Area. They include strong metrics from Marin County schools. Marin County schools are mostly operating right now in some form of cohort instruction. And many districts are planning a more robust return to a hybrid learning model sometime in March. I do know that there's been lots of media coverage about Marin County. It's often the case that you've got to dig into district plans to actually find exactly what they're doing. But nonetheless, the leadership that we're seeing from Marin County is inspiring and points towards the safety of reopening our schools. Also included in recent, as of January 14th, is a reassembled reassembled set of guidelines from the state of California about all of the various health and safety protocols that must be in place when schools reopen. Included in that consolidated document issued on January 14th is the language that I pulled here on the slide about physical distancing requirements in schools. And I'll read, this is from the state and very recently, that school districts are instructed to maximize space between seating and desks. Distance teacher and other staff desks at least 6 feet away from student and other staff desks. Distance student chairs at least 6 feet away from one another, except where 6 feet of distance is not possible after a good faith effort has been made. And I bring this up because we'll talk a little bit about why we're contemplating moving into a hybrid model and not a 5-day per week form of instruction. And so I'll ask that you sort of hang on to this idea, both for later in the presentation and as we talk live in just a few minutes. I'd like now, keeping in mind that little graphic about the 3 lanes that we must travel, we just talked a little bit about some of the requirements and permissions established by state, local health officers. Let's jump over a lane and talk now about district readiness and collective bargaining, both of which work hand in hand. So for many months, we've been reporting pretty faithfully on our readiness. There are a strong set of reopening documents available to the public for inspection on our website. They include comprehensive campus safety plans for elementary, middle, and high school, as well as our pre-K locations. They also include lots of resources, safety resources for families, reopening dashboards, which I'll show you in just one moment, and an ongoing tally of COVID-19 on-site cases. It is the case that we have had COVID-19 positive individuals on our campuses. Right now, however, no individual, no member of our staff has contracted COVID-19 on a school location. In effect, they got it somewhere else, they showed up on campus, and then they were isolated or quarantined, and in keeping with the current guidance. Our reopening readiness dashboard looks like this. I know many of you have seen it. This is pulled from a couple of weeks ago. And over the course of many months, we've been steadily working on completing a whole variety of tasks related to facilities upgrades, the establishment of health practices, development of training materials, as well as materials for families and students. You can see that there are a couple of pending items all required for us to reopen, and they include collective bargaining agreements, and then a final check on a brand new plan by the city of Berkeley. I know a number of folks have reached out to me recently to understand sort of what is the legal source for the requirement that we engage in collective bargaining in order to reopen our schools. It feels confusing. If public health officers say we can, then why can't we just do it? There is a whole lattice work of laws that both protect the rights of students. They also protect the rights of workers. In 1976, here in the state of California, a legislator passed what's called the Education Employees Relations Act, EERA. And this, like other accompanying legislation, establishes the right of unions, associations of employees, to collectively bargain working conditions. What that law says is that when there is a change to working conditions, and most certainly a switch to distance learning or a switch to hybrid learning re-envisions the working conditions on a minute-by-minute basis for every one of our employees, the requirements to bargain the effects of those changes are triggered by the EERA. This is a process that districts throughout the country are going through, and I know many of you are following news as you sort of watch sort of union district tensions bubbling over in cities like Cincinnati and Chicago and San Francisco and New York. And while we're fortunate to not have open tension, we've been working very collaboratively. The obligations to work in partnership with our labor unions are nonetheless present for Berkeley Unified as well. I'd like to describe just a little bit about how collective bargaining works in California, because these are somewhat relevant to the reason for the importance of collective bargaining in our reopening efforts. So first, it is the case that when we're at the table with any of our bargaining partners, our unions, that it's possible for either party to declare an impasse. Impasse essentially is that one party or the other feels that it feels that we are no longer making progress at the table. If impasse is declared, then it triggers a state mandated process by which there's a mediator assigned to the district. Eventually that leads to the creation of a fact-finding panel, and then eventually a non-binding report by that panel. This process can take months, and a district that finds itself locked up in impasse can spend months essentially with the status quo, unable to move forward, unable really to sort of gather the support of their employees. There are also a number of potential consequences if districts decide to act unilaterally to change working conditions for their employees. This is something we'd call unilateral implementation. And in that case, although we never know exactly what will happen, it triggers processes by which unions can seek injunctive relief, essentially sort of a restraining order on the implementation of a new practice. And it can, under certain conditions, trigger employees to launch safety strikes. And such things are permissible under certain conditions, and may not eventually, if they find their way to a judge, be considered a illegal work stoppage. And then finally, it's also really important to recognize that unions are democratic institutions. Union leaders do not have the ability to agree to conditions for their employees, but rather can bring tentative agreements forward to their members for a vote. And so ultimately, independent of what any health officer says, there's a democratic process taking place as it's codified by local union bylaws that eventually leads to school reopening. And all of these things taken together account a little bit for the variation that we're seeing from district to district. Every district is different, every union is different, all the dynamics are different. And so it's a little bit of why we're seeing differences across the state of California. Let me jump over to how negotiations are going right here in Berkeley. So we have been essentially in a state of perpetual negotiations all the way since March of last year. There's been, as I said, sort of no end to changes in the working conditions of our employees since the pandemic struck all of us. And most recently, we've been working earnestly on all of the sort of items associated with reopening our schools into a hybrid model. I'm very pleased that just this week we were able to reach a tentative agreement that now permits volunteer teachers and others to begin to return to in-person instruction. Teachers right now are voting to ratify that tentative agreement. And I see this only as a milestone or a way station on the road to a larger reopening. I'd hate for any family to think that this is the end point of our reopening effort, but rather to consider this to be the first of many steps towards reopening our schools. So this is very positive news, and I'm grateful to BFT and our classified union for their engagement so that we get to this milestone point. We've also begun to close the distance on other differences between our two positions, including student testing for COVID-19, including reopening thresholds. And I'm going to talk much more about this in just one moment, about the importance of sort of how we conceive, or rather how we conceive of the conditions of reopening. but we're making progress, and I'm going to talk in just a minute about vaccines. We've also made a great deal of progress about when and how we would close classrooms in schools if there is COVID-19 transmission, about teachers who work from home, about how we'll screen students as they arrive on campus, and about how long we would take to phase in a potential model. So all of this is important to keep in mind, that we're making progress. And then I think most of Berkeley became aware through a Berkeley side article yesterday that BFT put its position about vaccination out in public. So I'll speak a little bit about sort of where the Berkeley Federation of Teachers has currently sort of stated its position as it relates to staff vaccination. Right now, BFT is proposing to the district that all staff must be vaccinated in order to return to a hybrid model of instruction. Their reasoning, as I've heard it expressed by them, and they are certainly capable of articulating themselves, is that this is a necessary and important step for the protection of individual teachers. Even though the data says in the aggregate that the risk is low, there is more protection for teachers if they are vaccinated and back in a school environment. This is all relevant, and it now puts the question back to the district as to sort of how to engage our teachers union and our other unions on the question of vaccination. For folks following along, most will know that we just on Monday of this week entered into what's called Phase 1B of California's vaccination distribution plan. This includes educators, but at this point, it's difficult to begin establishing a timeline about when those vaccinations may be available for our educators. We are working very, very closely with the city of Berkeley and our county public health office to begin to organize for the possibility of a vaccination event directly for BUSD staff. We have really good reason to be optimistic that through the city of Berkeley, that we may be able to work very efficiently to get vaccinations to our educators. And it leaves the district now with the question of whether or not to sort of insist on point of principle that we should open on the basis of the health officer's permission. Or whether we should seek to strike a quick agreement with our unions about vaccines, implement a vaccination program with the idea of returning as soon as our employees are vaccinated. So with that, that sort of brings us to a conclusion on sort of the updates. What I'm going to propose to do now is review the questions, 6 key questions that came up as a result of the community's participation in a thought exchange survey. This went out about 3 days ago, and we had hundreds of people participating, responding to each other's ideas. And the top 6 questions are represented here. I'll read them aloud, I'll respond to them. And then from there, we'll jump over to written Q&A as it's being submitted by you this evening, as well as live questions from folks who are raising their hand and hoping to offer a comment here tonight. So let's jump into the questions that came up from the survey that went out just a couple of days ago. Here's the first one. Why a hybrid model? Why not return to full-time learning? And some comments were voted on frequently by respondents. Hybrid model is complicated, it's increasing teacher stress, it's hard for parents to manage. Why can't we just go back full-time? And the reason that we're not able right now to go back to any version of full-time instruction, and by that I mean 5 days a week, 6 hours per day, goes back to the ongoing requirement that we institute social distancing practices in our schools. It continues to be the expectation, as you read, that we will make a good faith effort to implement that 6-foot distance between all individuals in classrooms, including the teacher. And to do that, we must be able to reduce down class size from current class sizes of anywhere between 20 and 30, depending on the grade, down to something that's lower and that permits students to have that space that is specified by the guidance. And so until those social distancing conventions are lifted, we have not been able to conceive of any model to bring back our students except a hybrid model. And as you look around the state, if you look at reopening plans, including plans in Marin County, you'll see that those districts too are contemplating a return into a hybrid model and not a 5-day per week full-time model. Let's jump over to number 2. How can we support middle and high school students? Can we bring them now for clubs, exercise, gardening? Our older students are suffering as well from social isolation. The answer is yes, we can. Part of the key to doing that is this most recent agreement that we've passed with the Berkeley Federation of Teachers that permits our volunteer teachers to come back. We're very optimistic that we're going to now start to see teachers from our gardening program, from our PE program, lots of clubs and other extracurriculars come back in the afternoon, now under the aegis of this agreement to be able to offer on-person experiences for students. Again, we're expecting that, we're hoping that that will be ratified by our BFT colleagues very shortly. And with only a short runway, just a matter of days, we're hoping to begin to introduce these in-person sort of extracurriculars at the high school as soon as we can. Why can't students be taught outside? Can't we bring more kids on campus by using outdoor space? There's plenty of public space and the weather usually allows it. This is a really good question. I know that there is data out there that suggests that being outside is safer, demonstrably safer. And it has definitely been part of the conversations we're having with our educators. We are right now in the process of purchasing a large number of classroom size outdoor shade structures that will be installed on many of our elementary campuses. And we've been in conversations with our teachers union about whether or not this is among the strategies that ultimately leads to confidence among our educators to come back. We believe that this is going to be part of what some educators decide to do to utilize outdoor space. But we don't think that it's going to become a requirement that teachers are teaching students outside, nor has it really evolved to be a sort of factor in building the level of confidence that leads to a bargaining agreement with our teachers union. Number 4, what are the plans for the fall? We need to tell our middle and high schoolers what to expect this spring and fall. We need to give them some hope. And then our block schedule is being considered for the high school. I'd love to tell you sort of how I think the spring and the fall are going. I imagine that it's going to take place in some stages. I think in the next couple of weeks, just like we've seen an agreement on volunteers from our unions, that we're going to see a quick succession of agreements begin to take place about the conditions for reopening and about the actual schedules for hybrid learning at elementary, pre-K, middle school, and high school. I do think that there's going to start to be quick motion taking place in the next couple of weeks. I do see that we will be in a hybrid model this year. I think that that will be true for our elementary school. I think it's also true for middle schools. High school is going to be difficult to get to a hybrid model, but I imagine a lot of after school activities taking place over the course of the spring. Over the summer, we're planning for a fully in-person version of all of our BUSD summer programming. We're not planning on offering distance learning in our summer programming. And we're planning at this point that our assumption will be a return to full-time learning, unless it's prohibited again by the direction of state and local public health officers. But I sort of see over the course of weeks and months that there's going to be motion. And I sort of say that sort of contemplating that what I'm saying in public will be taken seriously by students and families, and can say with a measure of confidence, having worked through so many of these details, that this is the way that I see the sort of path unfolding for all of us here in Berkeley. And then can educators be prioritized for vaccines? How might that work? We're working very actively on this right now. We are in near daily communication with our partners over at City Berkeley to try and organize a vaccination event for our employees. And I've said several times over the last few weeks that vaccinations is likely to prove the key for reopening our schools. I fully recognize that they are not required by the public health officers in order to reopen. And yet we're hearing in district after district across the state of California that the call for vaccinations as a way to build confidence, as a way to build a hybrid learning model that is not as restrictive, and as a way to pass collective bargaining agreements is the way forward. And so here in the district, we're left with the decision about how to interpret and react to the very clear call from teachers unions across the state that vaccination is a critical part of reopening. And then finally, what are teacher and staff concerns? Teachers are asking for precautions beyond the CDC. Why is that? And there's a number of other questions here, and I'm going to sort of touch on the last comment in just one second. Teachers are articulate sort of champions of their own positions, and I know that our teachers union leadership has been articulate with the public as well about their particular stance. And so I won't try to represent our teachers' view, but it is my job to listen carefully to all of our staff, just as I'm listening carefully to our community. As I listen, I continue to hear concerns not only about individual teachers, but about their families, about people that they care for who may have underlying health conditions, about elderly loved ones who may be living with them or may not be. I'm also hearing concerns about those stories of teachers who have contracted COVID-19 and have become ill. We know that those stories are out there and that that's true as well. And then teachers unions have also expressed concern generally that they want to be able to work with students in a manner that is as least restrictive as possible, and that vaccines are a way to sort of build the confidence that leads to a better school experience. Those are among some of the things that I've heard. I do know that teachers, though, are perfectly capable of articulating their own viewpoints on this. And then finally, I guess I'll point out these bullet points are a little bit contradictory to one another, and they reflect some of the differences that we're seeing in our community. And then this last comment, at the last town hall, a parent said the teachers are only working 40%. I know that my child's teachers are working way beyond 100%. Let's show some respect for the human beings who are educating our kids. I agree with that completely. I appreciate the sentiment, and I'm glad that this was upvoted enough to sort of make the top 6 list. We must continue to remember that we're all in this together, and that it's together that we're going to create the agreements that lead to school opening. And when we engage in divisive sort of rhetoric against each other, blaming one another, in fact, I think we create more distance from our goal of reopening schools. I think we create an embattled set of employees, which ultimately doesn't lead to the kind of partnership that will open our schools. So we're now to the point that we're going to sort of switch up the format. Right now it is 7:32. We've spent about half of our time reviewing some background information, going through some thought exchange survey, and we're now going to go back and forth between some of the Q&A questions that are written already by folks who are listening in, and the folks who have raised their hand hoping to be able to ask a question. Now, there are a large number of participants. We're now up at over 500. And so if you are called to raise your hand, my request is that you limit your comment or question to only 30 seconds for the purpose of trying to move through as many comments and questions as we possibly can. So with that, Jessica, why don't we jump over to a written question, and then we'll go over to a live question. And we're going to spend the next half an hour just reviewing questions, taking them live and from the Q&A.
Okay, I will start with a question from Maria Frausto. My kids are behind academically. Does the district have a plan for summer program to help them catch up?
Thank you for that question. Yes, we're actively working right now, both with the city of Berkeley, with a whole variety of additional third-party partner organizations, and to plan for our own staff to be able to offer, as I said again, in-person learning experiences this summer. For example, we already know that we're going to be working with an organization to expand a program called STEM Steps. We have now over 200 spots open for students who would like to participate in that program. We're also working with a science camp called Camp Edmo, working with folks in Vision 2020 over at the city, and then planning to expand actually specialized sort of clinics for reading and math through organizations like Wilson. And that will be in addition to all of our standard summer programming through our Bears and Learns program staff, as well as our own teachers. So what we hope to be able to do is produce a catalog of the summer learning opportunities, get that catalog out in concert with the city so that folks know about a whole variety of additional academic resources for the summer. And Jessica, let's jump over to a live question.
Okay. I'm going to allow Michael Schwartz.
And Mr. Schwartz, good evening. There's lots of folks who want to speak, so I'll ask you to limit your comments to 30 seconds, please.
No problem. As I mentioned before, I'm a New Yorker. I can talk quickly. I want to thank you guys for the progress. I do appreciate it. I want to recognize it and say thank you. I also want to say that we need to move a lot faster. Every day lost are life experiences and days that are never going to be returned. We have Danville that is open, Orinda that is opening, San Ramon that is open, Marin that is open, Irvine that is open, San Diego that is open. We are not unique in this. It is not something that's a faraway country or a faraway state. It is right next to us. We have the ability, we have the resources. Let's speed it up. Let's make it happen as quickly as possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Schwartz. I appreciate that. And I'm just going to reiterate that we also feel that a very similar sense of urgency. We know that we need to move as quickly as possible to serve the Berkeley community right now. Jessica, could we jump over to one of our written questions and then back again to a live question?
Will do. Let me go back to the questions. Okay. If a teacher volunteers to be back on campus, does that mean that that individual's class would begin a hybrid model?
That's a great question. The answer is no, not yet. If a teacher is volunteering to come in, that teacher still continues to have distance learning responsibilities. And that is because not all of the students assigned to that class would choose to come in, and because of social distancing, even if a lot wanted to. The way this volunteer program works, and I think it's going to last about 6 weeks before we start to really see a larger reopening. Teachers will be asked to select students from their class who are most in need of in-person support. That could take place in a variety of ways, including a morning support class if the teacher has the availability, an afternoon support class, and we're offering incentives to teachers to do an after-school class as well in person. So we're going to see in this opening stage a lot of variability as teachers work with their own schedule to create in-person learning opportunities for students in their class. And that variability is going to give way to a lot more uniformity as we move into a hybrid model and are able to offer an in-person learning experience to any family who wants it.
Should we move to a live question now?
Yes, please. That's great.
Okay. MK, you should be able to speak.
Hi, yes, this is Mara Colesas. I was trying to log in and I couldn't, so I punched MK, but it's me. So I want to ask, I'm very concerned about elementary schools, but I'm also very concerned about middle schools. And assuming that health officials give the green light for middle schools to open in the near term, that it's, likely to be the case. What are the concrete steps that the district is taking today that will address the various health and safety logistics requirements regarding children necessary to ensure the USD schools are on track and ready to reopen as soon as health officials permit? Because without the planning on scheduling right now, it's my understanding by talking to different key actors, we won't be able to open middle schools without the scheduling. And that's a purely logistical issue, and it would be a shame. That's a comment, and thank you.
Yep. Thank you very much, Mara. I appreciate you being here tonight. We are right now working on hybrid schedules for middle and for high school. There have been a number of conversations taking place at both of those levels, and those include at the middle school level a proposal about what a hybrid learning model would look like at the middle school. We're conceiving at this point of, at least in this first stage of reopening, that in-person learning would be taking place in the afternoon after a morning of distance learning classes. There's a number of reasons for that. There are two things that are far more complicated at secondary schools than at elementary schools. One is that every teacher has a very unique subject area credential. And the second is that students go to 6 teachers. And so that master schedule, along with these credentialing requirements, creates both difficulties with social distancing, difficulties with a hybrid model, and difficulties with staffing. And so this particular model, while it's really ungratifying in many ways, can be staffed, can continue to offer a core of learning to families that will stay home in the early stages, while also offering an afternoon and after school opportunity for learning and socialization for middle school students. And we're also looking at a very similar method of organizing the high school. I do think that this will not be the permanent state of hybrid learning, but as I'm sort of conceiving of this first stage of hybrid learning at the middle and high school level, this is so far what we're getting back as we've been engaging with our educators. And Jess, let's jump over to a written question.
Okay, the next written question is from Amanda Toporek. She is a Berkeley High School teacher. How is the district getting educator input on logistics of reopening outside of collective bargaining negotiations? Guidelines are one thing, but how do they look on the ground? Will take a lot of work and logistics.
Yeah, these are great questions. And hi, Amanda. It's nice to hear from you. So we have been, as we've been going through the bargaining, mainly leaning on feedback as it's being collected by our teachers union. We understand that there's a high degree of confidence in union leadership expressed by the big majority of our teachers, and that their ability to collect feedback from teachers and represent that feedback to us is a really valid way of collecting the concerns of teachers and representing it at the bargaining table. So it's been, because there's been so much bargaining going on, that's been the primary method for really understanding the viewpoint of teachers. It's through the collective bargaining process and the representation of teachers' view through their union. We do know that as we get these agreements, that we're going to have a period of training in front of us. Coming back to school in the models that we're describing, part-time learning, social distancing, clearly defined processes for getting kids on and off campus. There's going to have to be a period of several days in which intensive training will take place. That's both remote training as well as on-site training for every staff member who will have to be responsible for maintaining these safety protocols. And so there will be in the sort of run up to a school reopening, a period in which we'll be offering training. As we've represented on our dashboard, those training materials are ready and available and will be used as soon as we understand what the details of the schedule will look like.
Sorry, I was muted. I'm going to allow Daniel to speak. Daniel?
Yeah, hi. Thank you so much for the data and the updates. It's helpful to hear we're making progress, but it's been a year and it's not enough. And I have spoken personally to school superintendents in the state of California about how they have reopened. I've read the research from Rhode Island, from San Francisco, from Marin, and over, it's the same central theme. Leadership has decided, not polled, not negotiated, decided that in-person school was the higher priority and that all other challenges and concerns had to fall in line. They did this through a strong and clear conviction and action, returning to school, bringing the staff to schools, and working from the position that schools will open. So I ask you, what are the leadership tools that you have not yet used that are at your disposal that are still keeping our schools closed? And this is a question, sir, not just to you, but to the board as well.
Thanks, Daniel, for the question. I appreciate its pointed nature, and I think that that's a fair question at this moment. As I've been trying to describe over the course of this pandemic, it is really critical that we are working together. That includes making agreements with our collective bargaining unions, as well as demonstrating both to them and the community that we're fully prepared. And doing so in a way that's fully transparent. The leadership actions to date have included a vast array of facilities preparation, training materials, building entire teams to do contact tracing, standing up testing programs, all of those things. At this point, I think now in the very final stretch of this sort of run to reopen, the partnership with the city around vaccinations, being able to move towards these sort of final agreements, strikes me as the sort of the last in a long number of steps that will be completed here like it's been completed in other districts, and like it will continue to take many other districts months to complete. I do recognize that there are differences between districts right now. Many others have been able to open where we have not been able to. And many other districts, about 2/3 in the state of California, are closed and are probably behind where we are. I'm not trying to make excuses for where we are. I know that there are folks who are sort of out in front of us. But at this point, I think that the sort of path forward is beginning to emerge. And that for these coming weeks, we need to continue to work with our educators, express patience, and that we will see these reopenings very shortly.
Dr. Stevens, if I can just add, I think from the board perspective, I can't attest to why other districts have negotiated with their unions in different ways. I can tell you that we've set numerous benchmarks, some of which we met and some of which we haven't. I think that, we did open up cohorts before any other district in the East Bay was opening up cohorts. We had truly hoped that we would have more teachers and staff able to volunteer to open more cohorts throughout our schools. But then we hit the surge. We were able to keep the 3 schools open that we did have the cohorts, but we couldn't open more. I still feel very strongly that the board is committed to working to get schools open as soon as possible. And I think we want to learn from these other districts. We've looked at Marin. I didn't know Dublin was open, and I'd like to learn more about it. But we also feel that our teachers and our staff are key partners. And together we need to serve the best needs of our students. So we need to have agreements to move forward. We're not at a position where we want to draw a line and our teachers say no. If we want schools to open, we need to do it together. But we need to have the science behind us. We need to have the public health behind us. And we need to be able to get the agreements to move forward. So I too am impatient. I want them to open, and I want them to open soon. And we'll continue to work to make that happen.
Thanks. Jessica, why don't we jump over to a written question?
This question is from Kia Morshit. I am currently a freshman at Berkeley High School. I was wondering what risks educators see if they are vaccinated. Once teachers are vaccinated, why can't they go fully back to work with masks, distance, etc., not hybrid?
I appreciate that question. So it is right now the position of our teachers union that they will go back to work if they're vaccinated. They made that public yesterday in statements that were covered by Berkeley side. Again, the rationale for not being able to go back for 5 days has nothing to do with teachers. It has to do with the current guidance established by the state and reinforced by local health officers that we must continue to enact social distancing, even if individual educators have been vaccinated. If that is lifted, that is really the sort of key feature in being able to return to more days per week, more hours per day. And until it's not, we are left sort of struggling with ways to divide the workday, divide the work week.
Okay. Next person is Sandy Stokes. Sandy, you can unmute yourself.
I did not have a question prepared, but seeing as I'm here, I wanted to know what your thoughts were on teachers live streaming their classes once they get back into the classroom.
I appreciate the question, Sandy. We have here been having conversations about whether or not that's going to work. We've been getting very clear feedback from our educators that the sort of prospect of trying to teach live and teach kids at home at the same time is just not a realistic expectation, sort of on a minute by minute, hour by hour basis. We weeks ago now, actually months ago, sort of moved away from the prospect of trying to do what some folks are calling concurrent teaching, given that it is so stressful and sort of burdensome, again, on a minute by minute basis for educators, that it just didn't feel like it was practical or sustainable to move in that direction. So that's currently not part of the models that we're entertaining, that teachers would be live streaming instruction from their class while they have kids in their room. Jessica, back over to you.
Okay, so we'll ask a question from the Q&A from Jessica Wolin. If hybrid for BHS is too difficult to implement this spring, how will BHS open for full-time school in the fall? What is the plan to get BHS open for school?
Yeah, that is, I think it's the question on everybody's mind, and it's on my mind as well. I'm talking a lot about this sort of social distancing requirement and the difficulty that imposes on large comprehensive high schools like Berkeley High. It's far easier to enact in small schools, including small high schools. And yet we have sort of struggling to find comprehensive schools that have designed an effective hybrid learning model. There's plenty of versions out online that anybody can go and check out, and you can sort of see the limitations as you look at these designs. Right now, I've sort of described what I imagine would be a probable first step for Berkeley High School, again, subject to agreements. And then it is possible that in the run up through the spring that we really, sort of throw the whole thing up in the air and begin to think more about block schedules, think about building out into alternative spaces, and think even about expanding the number of staff who would be teaching high school kids so that we can get more kids, more days. It stands as a really pressing need for me, as I know that it is for the principal, for staff, and for families to make sure our high school kids are getting back on.
And Dr. Stevens, just to add, I mean, I think what we're also hoping and anticipating and listening to Dr. Fauci is that we really are able to ramp up vaccinations through the spring and summer. And if we can get to the point where we hit the fall and there's a determination that there's herd immunity of 70%, then hopefully a lot of these conditions that are being placed on us will start to fall away. So I think I'm trying to continue to be optimistic, not hallucinate about it, but that there is still a possibility if our federal government can step up with the vaccination program, that will really help us return to normalcy in the fall.
And I think, if there were anything, if we could move away from social distancing conventions, maintain masking, maintain contact tracing, tests, attestations, symptom screening, all of those things together, less the social distancing, is not quite normal school, but that's what it takes to bring students back full-time 5 days a week. And that's what we really hope is going to be true as we're sort of looking at August. Jessica, I think we're jumping back over to a live question now.
That's right. The next person is Daniel Stolzenberg. Daniel, you can unmute yourself.
Unmute. Thank you.
Wait, we have double.
You may have two devices going right now.
Just leave. Okay. According to your presentation, Dr. Stevens, students don't in fact need to be 6 feet apart from each other as opposed to the teacher if it's not possible. I know that there's some maybe considerable public health evidence that hybrid models bring greater risk because many students tend to expose themselves to much larger social networks when they're not in school full time. And also public health authorities who say 3 feet is adequate. So I'm not saying one is right, one isn't, but these are different risk factors. So I want to know how you weighed those relative risks to come down on the side that it must be 6 feet of social distancing and therefore we can't open in person full time if on the time scale we're working in, it's even possible because of new variants, just like the predictable winter surge that everyone saw coming months ahead of time made the whole January opening obviously fictional months ahead of time. So that's my question.
Yeah, I appreciate the question. I don't have the answer to it necessarily. When I read the sort of consolidated guidance from the state, published only a couple of weeks ago, that continues to reinforce the notion that 6 feet of distance is the standard that districts should attempt, make good faith effort to create in a reopening plan. I read that seriously, that continues to be an important part of public health guidelines. What good faith means is a question unanswered in those guidelines, and ultimately one that communities I know will begin to wrestle with as they sort of think about how to reduce down the number of the sort of feet, the radius. I don't think that it sort of passes the good faith test to say that we tried, but we're going back full time into the crowded hallways of Berkeley High School or into classrooms that are 650 square feet, but that have 30 students in them. I think that we would have a tough time sort of saying that we had made a good faith effort, but that is our solution, as opposed to, practical, although difficult models for achieving a hybrid education. So I'm not proposing that this is the right thing. I'm not saying certainly that I like it. And I don't know what good faith is intended to mean. But I do think that public health continues to be serious about social distancing as one of many layered strategies that school districts must continue to practice until, as Director Sinai said, we're sort of getting on the other side of this herd immunity question. Jessica, back over to you. And I think we're going to do, it's 7:55. I think we'll probably take one more written question, one more live question, and then we're going to say good evening.
Okay, let me scroll here. There's quite a few questions. Just want to make sure that I'm getting a good range. Okay, from Maria Elena Castañeda. How would you consider a shorter day? Would you consider a shorter day, 8 a.m. to 1 p.m. instead of a hybrid model? Denver Unified is following that model, elementary and middle schools, and doing well. No contamination, hospitalizations, or deaths as our unions fear.
It's a great question. Yeah, there are so many different ways that districts are sort of dividing up essentially dividing their student body and dividing the day to create these social distancing conventions. There are ways that include a shortened day, students attending in the AM and the PM. Larkspur, for example, will be moving into that model around March 15th. That's sort of what I understand from their plans. There's also other districts that are playing around with models where students would attend a fuller day, meaning something like 9 to 3 for 2 days per week or 3 days per week, so that the other group of students could attend on those sort of off days. Those are sort of the key models that I'm seeing across districts, but they're generally still adhering to state and local guidance about achieving social distancing. So the two key models that we've been looking at, and then in fact, we'll be sending a survey out about to elementary families very shortly, probably tomorrow, has to do, one that we've sort of made very public, that we would have distance learning in the morning and in-person learning in the afternoon, stretching all the way to 5:30 at night. A second model, a little bit more like the one Ms. Castañeda just raised, would give 2 full days per week, from the morning all the way until 5:30 in the afternoon, while then the B group, the alternate group of students, would come for the other 2 days per week. So again, we're sort of down to, I think, 2 models at the elementary level. We're going to be doing a survey of elementary families in the coming days to get a sense of how many folks actually want to come back. And that gives us the sort of final bit of information we need to actually come to an agreement about a schedule, I think in the next week or 2 with our teachers union. And then Jessica, we're going to jump to one last live question, and then we're going to call it a night.
Okay, Shalene Stein, you should be able to speak now if you unmute yourself.
Hi, Ms. Stein.
Superintendent Stevens. I really appreciate you walking through some of these logistics with us. And my question is very much related to the last 2 that you received about sort of social distancing in a hybrid model. I really want to speak to what, good faith likely means, right? Especially from the elementary perspective, because I think a lot of the examples you've given us pertain to large classrooms, 30 and over, crowded hallways, and that in our schools in Berkeley are higher education, like the high schools and the middle schools. From an elementary perspective, the models around us all prioritize in-person instruction. Most offering this 4 days a week. And the mandate to prioritize in-person instruction is a state mandate. If we look at what's happening in private schools around us, you see that good faith means that when children are stationary, that they try to put the desks apart from each other, but that children, when cohorted, which they would be in any of these models, any of these hybrid models, are allowed to play together, and that play is a huge part of their learning. Private schools, which implement the same public health standards we do, have classes of up to 16 people. And that is basically the same as many of our elementary school classroom sizes, especially if you take into account that not everyone will want to return. So I just wanted to thank you for entertaining alternate models and really encourage you to consider models that really understand from the elementary perspective that, kids, even with social distancing, can interact together.
Thank you, Ms. Stein. All of that was very, very well said. I appreciate the comments, and do know that we are committed as we get these models worked out. The next step will be then to make sure that we're maximizing the number of students who can attend for the most possible days per week. And I do think that there's going to be added flexibility as we go through this process. On behalf of the district, on the school board, I really want to thank everybody for the hour that you've spent with us this evening. Appreciate that over 500 people joined us tonight to be updated about the current state of permissions, about collective bargaining, about vaccinations, and appreciate the thoughtful questions that you've asked, both written out and as well the questions that we were able to take live. Director Sinai, thank you very much for representing the Board of Education tonight. Really appreciate having you here. And then Jessica, thank you again for the magic behind the scenes just to pull all of this together. So please know that we will be having a school board meeting next Wednesday evening where we'll be offering further updates both to the board and to the community. I do expect, as I said before, that we're sort of entering a period in which we're going to experience many more announcements and a lot more progress taking place over the course of the coming weeks. So we're committed to keeping the schools up, to keeping the community updated and to getting our schools reopened so that we can have children back in our classrooms and playgrounds and deliver them the sort of experience that they so desperately need and deserve. So with that, thank you very much to everybody, and we hope to see you all very soon. Good night, all.